Ashstorm, a post-apocalyptic thriller. Written by Merrick. Please take a moment to share this story with a friend. The more friends who know about our stories, the more stories we can make. Thank you. Chapter 1. Shadows in the Storm. The ash fell like snow, blanketing everything in a gray, suffocating silence. Jude pulled his scarf tighter around his mouth and nose, adjusting the filtration mask that allowed him to breathe in this hellscape. Ahead of him, Brock lumbered forward, his hulking frame practically immune to the weight of the Ashstorm. Behind them, Reed and Finn struggled with a half-loaded sled, its contents barely visible beneath the choking dust. "Keep it moving," Jude shouted over the howling wind. His voice sounded small, swallowed by the endless storm. Reed shot him a glare, his face smeared with grime. The younger man's cocky edge had worn down after hours of dragging supplies through this wasteland. "You think I'm not trying?" Reed snapped, gripping the sled's handle with renewed force. "This storm's worse than last time." "Last time we were prepared," Jude retorted, scanning the horizon for any sign of shelter. The landscape was a sea of jagged ruins, long dead structures that jutted from the ash like the bones of some ancient beast. Finn, the smallest of the group, paused to adjust his own mask, his sharp eyes darting nervously. "This is bad, Jude. If we don't find cover—" "We will," Jude said firmly, cutting him off. He had to believe it. The others depended on him to keep moving, to keep their minds focused on survival. And yet, his own thoughts betrayed him. Every storm felt worse than the last, and every trek deeper into the wilderness seemed like a gamble they were losing. Ahead, Brock stopped abruptly and turned back toward Jude. Structure. Northwest. Jude followed the man's gaze and saw it, a dark outline barely visible through the swirling ash. It wasn't much, just a battered warehouse or hangar, but it was something. A flicker of hope. "Let's go," Jude ordered. He picked up the pace, his boots crunching against the ash-covered ground. The building loomed larger as they approached, its rusted exterior pockmarked with decay. Jude motioned for the others to stay back as he approached the entrance, rifle raised. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, revealing a cavernous interior bathed in pale, filtered light streaming through cracks in the walls. "Clear!" Jude called out, stepping inside. The others followed, dragging the sled in behind them. Finn collapsed onto the floor, coughing into his sleeve. "I swear this storm's gonna kill us before the ash does." "Not if we keep moving," Jude said, scanning the space. It was empty, save for a few broken crates and a sagging metal beam. "Get some rest. We'll head out as soon as it's safe." "Nah." Reed muttered something under his breath, but he didn't argue. The group settled in, peeling off their masks and wiping the grime from their faces. Jude leaned against the wall, his rifle still in his hands, his eyes fixed on the doorway. Out here, the storms were only part of the danger. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Ash. The warehouse was cold and quiet, the kind of silence that pressed down on Jude's ears and made his thoughts louder. He sat near the rusted doorway, his rifle resting across his lap, watching the Ashstorm swirl just outside. The faint blue glow of his filtration mask's indicator light cast shadows on the walls, flickering as if mirroring his doubts. Behind him, the crew was restless. Finn leaned against a crumbling crate, fiddling with a pre-cataclysm watch that had long since stopped working. Reed, as usual, was pacing. Brock, ever the silent giant, sat with his back against the wall, his massive frame an imposing shadow. "You're wasting your time with that thing," Reed muttered, nodding toward Finn and the broken watch. Finn barely looked up. "This thing might be the only relic left of a world where you didn't have to choke on ash to breathe." "Relic ain't gonna save us," Reed shot back. "We're running out of filters, food, and options, and Jude's safe place is looking more like a death sentence." Jude didn't react, though he could feel Reed's eyes burning into his back. "You got something to say, Reed?" Jude asked, his voice calm but sharp. Reed stopped pacing, smirking as he crossed his arms. Yeah, I got something to say. This whole plan of yours, finding shelter, looking for the so-called clean city, it's a fairy tale. We're just marching ourselves into an early grave. Better than sitting around waiting for one, Jude replied, keeping his tone measured. You got a better idea? Yeah. We stop chasing ghosts. Stick to what we know. Scavenge, survive. Keep moving. Jude finally turned, his gaze locking with Reed's. And what happens when we can't find more filters? Or when we cross paths with raiders again? Staying out here isn't surviving. It's dying slow. The tension in the room was palpable. Brock shifted slightly, the sound of his boots scraping against the concrete breaking the silence. Enough, Brock rumbled, his deep voice like distant thunder. Storm's still out there. We move when it clears. Until then, shut up. Reed muttered something under his breath but backed off, resuming his pacing. Jude gave Brock a small nod of thanks. The storm finally began to wane hours later, the howling wind replaced by an uneasy stillness. Jude stood at the doorway, scanning the horizon. The ash lay thick on the ground, unbroken except for the faint impressions of ruins in the distance. The sun was a dull, hazy orb, barely piercing the blanket of gray that hung over the world. We move, Jude said, his voice cutting through the silence. Pack up. The crew began gathering their gear, their movements automatic and tired. Finn struggled with the sled's straps, and Jude stepped in to help, tightening the frayed cords. Thanks, Finn said, glancing at Jude. You really think the clean city exists? Jude didn't answer right away. I think we can't afford not to believe in it. Finn nodded, though his expression was uncertain. He pulled his mask over his face, the faint blue glow of the filtration indicator lighting up. One by one, the others followed suit, and soon they were moving again, trudging through the ash. They hadn't been walking long when Brock stopped abruptly, raising a hand. Jude motioned for the others to stay quiet, scanning the horizon. What is it? Finn whispered. Brock pointed. Tracks. Fresh. Jude crouched, inspecting the ground. The faint outlines of boot prints were barely visible beneath the ash, but they were there, and they were recent. Whoever made these isn't far, Jude said. He glanced at the others. Stay alert. They continued cautiously, the tension rising with every step. The tracks led them toward a cluster of ruins, what might have once been a neighborhood, the skeletal remains of houses jutting from the ground like tombstones. Jude raised a hand, signaling for the group to spread out. They moved carefully, eyes scanning the shadows. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of their boots on the ash. It was Finn who found the source of the tracks first. He stopped suddenly, his eyes wide, and motioned frantically for the others to come over. Jude approached, his rifle at the ready. When he saw what Finn had found, his stomach tightened. A man lay slumped against the wall of a crumbling house, his body half buried in ash. He wasn't moving, but the faint rise and fall of his chest told Jude he was still alive. Barely. His face was gaunt, his skin pale, and his clothes were tattered and covered in soot. Who the hell is this? Reed muttered, keeping his distance. Jude crouched beside the man, checking his pulse. It was weak, but steady enough. Looks like he came from the city. The man's eyes fluttered open, and he looked at Jude with a mixture of fear and desperation. He tried to speak, but his voice was barely a whisper. Jude leaned closer. What happened to you? The man's lips moved, but the words were faint. Jude could only catch fragments. Clean city. Viktor. Sacrifices. Run. Jude's blood ran cold. Sacrifices? What do you mean? The man's breathing hitched, and his eyes rolled back. Whatever strength he had left was gone. Damn it, Jude muttered. He stood, his mind racing. What's he talking about? Finn asked, his voice trembling. I don't know, Jude said, though the pit in his stomach told him otherwise. He looked at the others. We keep moving. Reed crossed his arms. You sure about that? Maybe we should think about what he said. We don't have time to think, Jude snapped. The storm's clearing, and we need to move before we're caught out in the open. Brock grunted in agreement, hefting the sled. Finn hesitated but followed, casting one last glance at the dead man before trudging after the group. Reed lingered, his expression unreadable, before finally falling in line. As they disappeared into the ash, the man's last words echoed in Jude's mind. Sacrifices. Whatever the clean city was, it wasn't the sanctuary they'd hoped for. And yet, it was the only hope they had. Chapter 3. Ashes and Promises. The Ashstorm had passed, leaving the world a dull, suffocating gray. Jude led the group with determined steps, his boots crunching on the brittle ground. Every sound carried too far in the silence. Brock's heavy footsteps, the squeak of the sled's wheels, the faint wheezing from Reed's mask. The ruins they passed were skeletal outlines of a world long gone, their jagged edges like broken teeth against the pale horizon. Jude's mind churned with the dead man's last words. Clean city. Sacrifices. Viktor. Run. He glanced at Finn, who was uncharacteristically quiet. The boy's shoulders slumped as he trudged along, his eyes darting to every shadow. Reed, on the other hand, was brimming with tension. He kept glancing back at the way they'd come, muttering curses under his breath. You hear what that guy said, right? Reed finally spoke up, breaking the silence. Sacrifices? What the hell is that supposed to mean? It means we keep moving, Jude said without looking back. Reed scoffed. Keep moving? To what? A city that murders people? This place doesn't sound like salvation to me. It sounds worse than out here. Jude stopped abruptly and turned to face Reed, his voice cold. Do you have a better plan? Because if you do, now's the time to share it. Reed hesitated, his hands clenching into fists. Yeah, I've got a plan. We stop chasing this fantasy and start thinking about survival. We can scavenge, stock up, maybe find somewhere quiet. And die slow, Jude interrupted. You think you can outrun the ash storms forever? You think the filters will last? You know better than that. Brock cleared his throat, his voice low but firm. We stick together. No more arguing. Reed muttered something under his breath but fell silent. Jude turned and kept walking, his grip tightening on his rifle. He didn't need their approval. He just needed them alive long enough to reach the city. The group stopped for a quick break near the skeletal remains of what might have been a gas station. The building had collapsed inward, its roof a mangled heap of rusted metal. Finn knelt near the sled, adjusting the straps with shaking hands. You all right? Jude asked, crouching beside him. Finn nodded, though his expression betrayed him. Just that guy back there. You think he came from the clean city? Jude hesitated. I think he knew more than we do. And the sacrifices? Finn pressed, his voice barely above a whisper. You think it's real? Jude didn't answer right away. He glanced at Brock and Reed, who were quietly checking their gear a few yards away. Doesn't matter what I think. We keep moving. Finn frowned but didn't argue. Jude could see the boy's fear growing, but he couldn't afford to coddle him. Fear kept you alive. It also kept you sharp. By late afternoon, the sun was a pale smudge behind thick clouds of ash. Jude stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. Quiet. The group froze, their breaths audible through their masks. Jude scanned the horizon, his rifle raised. The landscape stretched out in desolation, but something felt wrong. Then he heard it, a faint hum, barely perceptible over the soft crunch of ash beneath their boots. It grew louder, mechanical and sharp, sending a chill down Jude's spine. Get down, he hissed, dropping to one knee. The others followed, crouching behind the crumbled remains of a low wall. Through the haze, Jude saw them, figures in sleek, dark suits, their faces obscured by advanced filtration masks. They moved in formation, methodical and efficient. At least 6 of them, armed and scanning the ruins with military precision. "Who the hell are they?" Reed whispered, his voice trembling. "Kidnapping teams," Jude muttered. He'd heard the rumors. Well-equipped squads that hunted survivors in the wilderness, dragging them back to the clean city. Seeing them now, those rumors felt all too real. "They don't look like scavengers," Finn said, his voice barely audible. "They're not," Jude said. "Stay quiet and don't move." The team spread out, their weapons drawn, their movements swift and practiced. Jude's heart pounded as one of them passed just a few feet from their hiding spot, the faint glow of the figure's mask illuminating the ash-covered ground. Reed shifted slightly, and Jude grabbed his arm, holding him still. "Don't," Jude mouthed, his grip firm. The team moved on, their voices crackling over a shared comms channel. Jude couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clipped and urgent. They were searching for something, or someone. When the figures disappeared into the haze, Jude exhaled slowly. "Let's move." Quietly. The group crept away from the ruins, keeping low and staying close to the ground. Jude's senses were on high alert, every sound and movement amplified. He knew they were still too close, but staying put was even more dangerous. After what felt like hours, they finally reached a more open stretch of land. Jude stopped and turned to the group. "We keep heading west. Don't look back." Reed's face was pale, his usual bravado gone. "Those people, they're taking survivors, aren't they?" Jude nodded. "For the city." "Why?" Finn asked, his voice trembling. "Doesn't matter," Jude said. "We're not sticking around to find out." The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence. They walked until their legs ached, the weight of the sled pulling on their arms. Jude's mind churned with questions he didn't have answers to, his grip on his rifle tightening with every step. When they finally stopped for the night, the group was too exhausted to argue. They found shelter in the remains of a school, the walls still intact enough to block out the worst of the wind. Jude sat by the doorway, keeping watch as the others rested. The stars were hidden behind the ash, but Jude stared at the horizon anyway. Somewhere out there was the clean city, and the answers he didn't want to face. Chapter 4. Ghosts of the City. The night was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that pressed down like a heavy weight. Jude sat by the doorway of the ruined school, his rifle across his lap and his eyes scanning the ashen horizon. The rest of the crew was asleep, their breathing slow and steady, their exhaustion keeping even Reed from stirring. Jude's thoughts, however, were anything but quiet. The kidnapping team's precision haunted him. They moved with purpose, their gear sleek and advanced, like something out of another world. They weren't just scavengers or raiders. They were predators. And Jude knew that if his crew had been spotted, they wouldn't have stood a chance. He glanced back at Finn, curled up under a tattered blanket, his mask resting beside him. The boy had a good heart, too good for this world. Jude didn't want to think about what Viktor's city would do to someone like Finn. The faint sound of footsteps snapped Jude out of his thoughts. He froze, gripping his rifle tightly, his finger brushing the trigger. The sound grew louder, deliberate and steady, coming from just outside the building. He stood slowly, his boots barely making a sound on the concrete floor, and moved toward the door. A shadow passed by the opening, and Jude's heart raced. He stepped outside, raising his rifle, his voice low and sharp. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. For a moment there was nothing but the faint rustle of the wind through the ruins. Then a figure stepped into view, their hands raised. The glow of their filtration mask's indicator light revealed a gaunt face beneath, pale and hollow-eyed. "Don't shoot," the man said, his voice hoarse. "I'm unarmed." Jude didn't lower his weapon. What do you want? I was looking for shelter, the man said, taking a cautious step forward. The storm drove me out of my hiding spot. Jude studied him carefully. The man's clothes were ragged, his frame thin and malnourished. He didn't look like a threat, but appearances meant nothing out here. You're alone? The man nodded. Been alone for a long time. Jude lowered his rifle slightly but kept his grip firm. You from the city? The man hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. I used to be. What happened? Jude asked, his voice cold. The man's shoulders slumped. I escaped. Barely. The city isn't what you think it is. It's a trap. Jude's grip on his rifle tightened. What do you mean? The man took another step forward, his voice trembling. They take people. Survivors. They call it sacrifices. They say it's for the greater good, to keep the city running. But it's worse than that. Worse how? Jude pressed. The man's breathing hitched, and he looked up at Jude with desperate eyes. They're not just killing people, they're taking something from them. I don't know what it is, energy, light, their souls maybe. But whatever it is, it's what keeps the city alive. And Viktor, he uses it for himself. Jude's stomach churned. He wanted to dismiss the man's words as the ramblings of a broken mind, but they lined up too perfectly with what he'd already seen and heard. Before Jude could respond, the man's eyes widened in terror. They're coming. Jude turned, his rifle snapping up instinctively. Through the haze of ash, he saw them. Two figures moving swiftly and silently toward the school, their filtration masks glowing faintly in the dark. The kidnapping team. Get inside, Jude hissed, shoving the man toward the doorway. He raised his rifle and fired, the crack of the shot shattering the night. One of the figures dropped, but the other ducked behind cover, returning fire with a precision that sent sparks flying off the concrete walls. The rest of the crew jolted awake, scrambling to their feet as chaos erupted. Reed grabbed his pistol, his face pale. What the hell is going on? Kidnapping team, Jude barked. Get ready to move. Finn fumbled with his mask, his hands shaking as he pulled it over his face. Brock was already up, grabbing the sled with one hand, and his shotgun with the other. The stranger huddled in the corner, his breaths ragged and panicked. The second figure fired again, pinning Jude behind the wall. He counted the shots, waiting for a pause, then leaned out and fired twice in quick succession. The figure dropped, their weapon clattering to the ground. Go! Jude shouted, motioning for the crew to move. They scrambled out the back of the school, dragging the sled behind them. Jude stayed at the rear, his rifle raised, scanning for any more threats. They ran until their legs burned, the ruins blurring into shadows as they moved. Finally, Jude slowed, motioning for the group to stop. He turned, his breathing heavy, but there was no sign of pursuit. Everyone okay? He asked, his voice rough. Define okay, Reed muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. What the hell were those guys? City enforcers, Jude said, probably looking for him. He nodded toward the stranger, who was hunched over, his hands on his knees. You brought that guy to us without asking? Reed snapped. You're gonna get us all killed. Jude ignored him and crouched in front of the stranger. Why were they after you? The man shook his head, his voice barely audible. Because I know what they're doing, and they don't let anyone leave alive. Jude stood, his jaw tight. We're not going back to the school. We keep moving, now. Reed started to argue, but Brock stepped forward, his imposing frame silencing him. The group fell into line, trudging through the ash once more. Jude stayed at the rear, his rifle ready, his mind racing. Whatever the clean city was, it was more dangerous than he'd imagined. But turning back wasn't an option. Not anymore. Chapter 5. The Road to Shadows. The ash had settled into an uneasy stillness, broken only by the crunch of boots and the faint creak of the sled's wheels. Jude led the group westward, his rifle slung but ready, his eyes scanning every shadow. The stranger they'd picked up the night before trudged along silently, his gaunt frame nearly blending into the wasteland. Reed's muttering was the first sign the group's fragile cohesion was fraying. "Great plan, Jude. Let's pick up every broken stray in the wasteland and see how fast we get killed." "Keep it down," Jude said without turning. Reed scoffed but didn't stop. "You don't think those city freaks will come looking for their missing team? Yeah, they're probably giving up on that right now." "Enough," Brock growled. His deep voice cut through the tension, but it didn't stop the glare Reed shot toward Jude. Jude ignored the exchange and glanced back at Finn, who was walking beside the sled, his hands gripping the straps. "How's it holding up?" "Better than I expected," Finn said, though his voice sounded strained. "But the filters, we're burning through them." "Better to burn through them than to choke," Jude said. The stranger stumbled slightly, catching himself on the sled. Jude slowed, gripping the man's arm to steady him. "You good?" The man nodded weakly. "I'm fine." Jude narrowed his eyes. "What's your name?" The man hesitated, his lips dry and cracked. "Call me Caleb." "All right, Caleb," Jude said. "You're with us now. That means you pull your weight." "I'll do what I can," Caleb said, though his voice lacked conviction. The ruins gave way to an expanse of open ground, the ash covering it like a thin layer of snow. Jude hated the openness. Too many angles, too little cover. He raised a hand, signaling the group to halt. "We'll cross fast," he said. "Keep tight. Brock, you take the sled." The big man nodded, grabbing the handles and hoisting the weight with ease. The group moved quickly, their pace hurried but cautious. The openness gnawed at Jude's instincts. It was too quiet. Halfway across, Finn stumbled. Caleb moved to help, but the sound of a distant engine made Jude's heart drop. He spun, scanning the horizon. There it was, a dark shape cresting the ridge behind them, moving fast. The faint hum of a motor grew louder, and Jude saw more shapes following. Raiders. "Run!" Jude barked. The group broke into a sprint, Brock dragging the sled behind him with massive strides. The raiders' vehicles roared closer, their engines coughing black smoke into the already polluted air. They weren't just hunting. They were toying with them, revving their engines and circling like vultures. "Get to the ruins!" Jude shouted, pointing toward a jagged cluster of half-buried buildings in the distance. "Go!" The raiders opened fire, bullets kicking up ash and dust around the fleeing group. Jude dropped to one knee, raising his rifle, and fired a few quick shots. One of the riders swerved, their bike skidding sideways, but it wasn't enough to stop the others. The group reached the ruins, ducking behind the jagged walls of what had once been a factory. The sled clattered to a halt, and Brock immediately turned, his shotgun ready. "They're circling," Reed said, peering through a crack in the wall. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by raw panic. "They're going to come in and pick us off." "Not if we hold them here," Jude said. He knelt beside Finn, who was struggling to reload his pistol with shaking hands. "You all right?" "Not really," Finn muttered, finally snapping the magazine into place. "What do we do?" Jude didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the others. Reed was jittery. Caleb looked like he might collapse, and even Brock seemed more tense than usual. The odds weren't great, but they'd faced worse. "We make a stand," Jude said. "Finn, Caleb, stay low and cover the sled. Reed, you're with me. Brock, you take the right flank." Reed hesitated, his eyes wide. "You serious? There's too many—" "Move!" Jude snapped, cutting him off. The raiders dismounted their vehicles, their shouts echoing through the ruins. They moved in loose formation, their mismatched armor glinting in the pale light. Jude raised his rifle, his breath steady, and waited. The first raider rounded the corner and Jude fired. The shot hit center mass, dropping the man instantly. Another appeared moments later, and Brock's shotgun roared, scattering him into the ash. Reed fired wildly, his shots hitting nothing but rubble. "We're screwed, Jude." "Focus!" Jude barked, firing again. A second raider fell, but the others pressed forward, their shouts growing louder. One of the raiders lobbed something. Jude caught the glint of metal and recognized the grenade too late. It landed near the sled, and Caleb dove on top of it, grabbing it with shaking hands and hurling it back. The explosion rocked the ruins, sending ash and debris flying, but it missed the group. Jude spared Caleb a glance, nodding in grim approval. "Nice work." The raiders faltered, their momentum breaking as they scrambled for cover. Jude took the opportunity to reload, his hands moving quickly. "Push them back." Brock stepped into the open, firing with deliberate precision. Each shot was a thunderclap, and each one hit its mark. The raiders shouted curses, retreating toward their vehicles. One by one they mounted up, their engines roaring as they sped away. When the last of the raiders disappeared over the ridge, Jude lowered his rifle, his chest heaving. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the crew's ragged breaths. "They'll be back," Reed muttered, slumping against the wall. "They always come back." "Not if we keep moving," Jude said, though he knew Reed wasn't entirely wrong. He turned to Caleb, who was sitting against the sled, his face pale. "You did good back there." Caleb gave a weak smile. "Guess I had something to prove." Jude nodded, his mind already racing. The clean city was still their only chance, but the dangers between here and there were multiplying. He glanced at the horizon, the sun sinking behind the ash-covered hills. The light was fading, and the road ahead was only getting darker. Chapter 6. The Shadows of Salvation. The air was thick with the smell of ash and sweat as the group trudged onward, their steps heavy and their breaths labored. The horizon offered no respite, just more gray and barren desolation. Jude kept his eyes forward, his rifle slung across his chest, his mind racing with thoughts of the raiders and the clean city ahead. Finn stumbled over a jagged rock, catching himself on the sled. Brock steadied him with one massive hand, his expression unreadable behind his mask. Caleb lagged behind, his frail body moving slower with each passing hour. Reed, as usual, muttered under his breath, his discontent growing louder with every mile. "This is suicide," Reed finally said, breaking the tense silence. "We're heading straight for a death trap." Jude ignored him, focusing on the horizon. "I'm serious," Reed continued. "You heard that guy. Sacrifices? Viktor? What kind of place do you think we're walking into?" "A place with clean air," Jude said, his voice flat. "A place where we don't have to worry about running out of filters or getting caught in a storm." Reed scoffed. "Yeah, and all it'll cost is our lives." "We don't know that," Finn said quietly, though his voice trembled. "What if it's not as bad as he said? What if it is?" Reed cut in. "What if we're just marching ourselves right into their hands?" "Enough," Jude said, his voice sharp. He stopped walking and turned to face the group. "I get it, Reed. You're scared. We all are. But we don't have a choice. Out here, we're dying slowly. In there, we have a chance. It's a gamble, but it's better than doing nothing." Reed opened his mouth to argue, but Brock's low growl silenced him. "Keep moving." Grumbling, Reed fell back in line. Jude let out a quiet breath and resumed walking, his grip tightening on his rifle. He didn't have time for Reed's doubts, not when every step brought them closer to the city, and closer to answers. Hours later, as the sun dipped low behind the ash-covered hills, the first signs of the city appeared on the horizon. At first, it was just a faint glimmer, a hazy shimmer of light that seemed out of place in the bleak wasteland. As they drew closer, the details became clearer. A massive dome loomed in the distance, its surface smooth and reflective, rising like a beacon from the barren landscape. "Is that it?" Finn asked, his voice a mix of awe and fear. "That's it," Caleb said, his voice hoarse. "The clean city." The group stopped to take it in. The dome was enormous, its edges shimmering faintly in the fading light. Around it, the ground was bare, the ash swept away in a perfect radius. Jude could see faint structures surrounding the dome. Watchtowers, maybe, or outposts. It was impossible to tell from this distance. "Looks peaceful," Finn said, though his tone was uncertain. "It's not," Caleb said, shaking his head. "The peace is an illusion. Everything inside that dome is built on lies." Reed snorted. "Sounds like you've got a lot of regrets, Caleb." "You don't know the half of it," Caleb muttered, his gaze fixed on the dome. Jude turned to the group. "We camp here for the night. We need to be sharp when we approach." "Camp here?" Reed said, incredulous. "Right out in the open? They'll see us coming from a mile away." "They'll see us no matter where we camp," Jude said. "Better to rest while we can." Reluctantly, the group set up camp. Brock positioned the sled as a makeshift barricade while Finn and Caleb huddled together, sharing a blanket against the cold. Jude took the first watch, sitting on a low outcropping with his rifle in his lap. The dome glimmered faintly in the distance, a silent reminder of what was waiting for them. Reed joined him after a while, his pistol tucked into his belt. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at the dome with a mixture of anger and fear. "You're making a mistake," Reed said eventually, his voice low. "Probably," Jude said, "but it's mine to make." Reed shook his head. "This isn't about you. It's about all of us. You drag us in there and we die. That's on you." Jude didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the dome. Reed sighed heavily and walked away, leaving Jude alone with his thoughts. The night passed uneventfully, though Jude's dreams were anything but peaceful. He saw flashes of blue light, heard screams echoing in the darkness. Viktor's name lingered on the edges of his mind, a shadowy presence he couldn't shake. When he woke, the sky was still dark, the faint glow of dawn just beginning to break through the ash-filled clouds. Jude roused the group, and they packed up quickly. No one spoke as they resumed their march toward the city. The air grew warmer as they approached, a strange contrast to the usual chill of the wasteland. The ground beneath their feet was harder, the ash thinning out until it disappeared entirely. The dome loomed larger with every step, its surface smooth and impenetrable. As they neared, Jude could see figures moving in the distance, guards patrolling the perimeter, their silhouettes sharp against the pale light. "Stay close," Jude said, his voice low, "and keep your heads down." They moved carefully, sticking to the shadows as they approached the edge of the dome. Jude's heart pounded in his chest, his grip tight on his rifle. The guards were well armed, their movements precise. This wasn't just a city, it was a fortress. Jude motioned for the group to stop, crouching behind a low wall. He studied the dome, his mind racing. Somewhere inside was the truth, about the sacrifices, about Viktor, about everything. He just had to find a way in. Chapter 7. Cracks in the Dome. The dome loomed over them, a massive, otherworldly structure that shimmered faintly in the pale light. Up close, its surface was seamless, a smooth expanse of metal and glass that reflected the barren landscape around it. Jude crouched behind a crumbling wall with the rest of the group, studying the perimeter through the scope of his rifle. The guards moved in tight, methodical patterns, their weapons sleek and advanced. These weren't scavengers or raiders. They were professionals. "Any bright ideas?" Reed muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Jude ignored him, lowering the rifle and scanning the base of the dome. The guards had the area locked down, but there was something strange about the ground just beyond their patrols. The ash didn't reach here, leaving the dirt exposed. Jude's eyes narrowed as he spotted faint lines in the soil, too regular to be natural. There, he said, pointing. Underground access. Reed squinted at the spot. How do you know? Lines in the dirt, Jude said. Vents, maybe. Probably leads to maintenance tunnels under the dome. Finn leaned forward, his face pale but determined. If there's a vent, we can get in through there. And what if it's a trap? Reed asked. Or worse, it's sealed. Then we find another way, Jude said. But this is our best shot. Brock nodded, hefting his shotgun. What's the plan? Jude glanced at the guards. They're focused on the surface. If we move fast and stick to cover, we can reach the vent before they see us. You mean if they don't see us? Reed said. That's a big if. Jude turned to him, his voice low and sharp. You want to sit here and argue, or you want to survive? Reed glared at him but said nothing. Jude looked at the others. Finn, Caleb, stay close to Brock. Reed, you're with me. We'll move in pairs. Quiet and quick. The group nodded and Jude took a deep breath, steadying himself. The clean city was so close now, its secrets just out of reach. Whatever waited for them inside, they couldn't turn back. Not now. Go, Jude said, motioning for Reed to follow. They moved swiftly, keeping low as they darted from shadow to shadow. Jude's heart pounded as they crossed the open ground, every step feeling like it might be their last. The guards continued their patrols, oblivious to the group's presence, for now. When they reached the edge of the dome, Jude knelt beside the vent and examined it. The grate was old but sturdy, bolted into the ground. He glanced back at Finn, who was crouched beside Brock a few feet away. Finn, get over here. The boy hurried over, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled a small toolkit from his pack. This is older tech, Finn whispered, inspecting the bolts. I can get it off, but it'll take a minute. You've got 30 seconds, Jude said. Finn nodded, his hands moving quickly as he worked to loosen the bolts. Jude kept watch, his rifle trained on the guards. One of them paused, turning toward their position, and Jude's breath caught in his throat. The guard lingered for a moment, then resumed his patrol. Almost there, Finn muttered, his voice tense. The last bolt came free, and Finn carefully lifted the grate, setting it aside. Beneath it, a narrow shaft led downward into darkness. Jude peered inside, the faint smell of damp metal and oil rising to meet him. Brock, take the sled and lower it in, Jude said. One at a time. The group moved quickly, lowering the sled first before climbing down the shaft. Jude was the last to go, replacing the grate as best he could before descending into the tunnel. The air inside was cooler, the walls lined with rusted pipes and cables. A faint hum filled the space, the sound of machinery somewhere deep within the dome. Everyone all right? Jude asked, his voice low. Better than being out there, Finn said, his voice shaky but steady. Jude turned to Caleb, who was leaning against the wall, his breathing ragged. You've been in these tunnels before? Once, Caleb said, a long time ago. They run under the whole city, but most of them are sealed off. Any idea where this one leads? Jude asked. Maintenance hub, maybe, Caleb said. But if we go deeper, we'll hit the lower levels of the city. Jude nodded, his mind racing. Let's move. The group followed the tunnel, their footsteps echoing softly in the confined space. The hum of machinery grew louder, and the air became warmer, tinged with a faint metallic taste. The further they went, the more oppressive the space felt, as if the walls were closing in around them. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a junction where several tunnels converged. A rusted sign hung from the ceiling, its letters barely legible. Maintenance access. Level 2. We're close, Caleb said, his voice strained. But we need to be careful. The lower levels are heavily monitored. Monitored how? Jude asked. Cameras, drones, Caleb said, and enforcers if they think something's wrong. Great, Reed muttered. Sounds like a walk in the park. Stay focused, Jude said. Finn, can you disable any cameras if we find them? Finn hesitated. If I can access a terminal, maybe. But I'll need time. Then we keep moving until we find one, Jude said. Let's go. They continued through the tunnels, the faint hum growing louder with every step. The air felt heavier now, the heat almost stifling. Jude's grip tightened on his rifle, his senses on high alert. Whatever waited for them ahead, he knew they were running out of time to turn back. Chapter 8. The Depths. The maintenance tunnels were a maze of rusted pipes, flickering lights, and low-hanging cables that made every step feel like a descent into the unknown. The faint hum of machinery reverberated through the walls, growing louder as Jude led the group deeper into the belly of the clean city. Finn stayed close to Jude, his eyes darting nervously at every shadow. Brock dragged the sled, his massive shoulders brushing against the narrow walls. Caleb shuffled along at the back, his breathing labored while Reed moved ahead of him, the tension in his shoulders unmistakable. Jude slowed as they reached another junction. 3 tunnels branched off, each labeled with faint peeling signs. Engineering, living quarters access, and energy extraction. Jude pointed to the sign marked energy extraction. That's where we're going. Reed turned, incredulous. Seriously? You want to go straight to the place where they're killing people? What happened to sneaking in? Jude ignored him, focusing on Caleb. What's ahead? Caleb hesitated, his hand gripping the wall for support. That tunnel leads to the lower levels, where they process the sacrifices. If you're trying to find answers, you'll get them there, but it's not somewhere you want to be caught. Jude glanced at Finn. Think you can find a terminal along the way? Maybe, Finn said, though his voice trembled. But if it's down there, it's going to be heavily monitored. Good, Jude said, adjusting his rifle. Let's move. The group hesitated, but Brock gave a nod and began dragging the sled toward the tunnel. The others followed, their footsteps echoing against the metallic floor. The further they went, the more oppressive the air became. The hum of machinery was louder now, almost a roar, and the walls seemed to vibrate with energy. Finn stopped abruptly, pointing to a small terminal mounted on the wall. There. I might be able to access the cameras from here. Jude motioned for the group to stop. Do it. Finn pulled out his tools and began working, his fingers shaking as he pried open the panel. Sparks flew as he connected wires and began tapping on the screen. This system is old, but it's encrypted. I'll need a minute. Jude turned to Caleb. What else do you know about this place? Caleb's face was pale, his eyes fixed on the floor. I know it's where they take the sacrifices. They drain them. Take whatever's inside them that powers the city. It's not just energy. It's life. Life? Finn asked without looking up. You mean like their souls? Call it whatever you want, Caleb said, his voice hollow. But when they're done, there's nothing left. Reed shook his head, pacing. This is insane. We should turn around right now. Quiet, Jude said, his eyes scanning the tunnel behind them. The air felt heavier, like they were being watched. Finn, how much longer? Almost there, Finn said, sweat beading on his brow. If I can loop the feed, we'll have a chance to move undetected. Suddenly a faint whirring sound filled the air, and Jude's heart sank. He recognized the sound immediately. Drones, Caleb whispered, his voice trembling. They're coming. Finn, hurry! Jude barked, raising his rifle. I'm trying, Finn said, his hands moving frantically over the terminal. The whirring grew louder, and Jude caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows. 2 sleek black drones floated into view, their lights scanning the tunnel. The machines were small but deadly, equipped with mounted turrets that gleamed in the dim light. Take cover, Jude shouted. The group scattered, ducking behind pipes and machinery as the drones opened fire. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, sending sparks flying. Jude leaned out from behind a pipe and fired, his shot hitting one of the drones squarely in its sensor. It exploded in a shower of sparks, crashing to the floor. "Got one," Jude called out, but the second drone adjusted its aim, firing a burst of bullets that forced him back into cover. Brock stepped forward, his shotgun booming as he fired at the drone. The blast sent it spinning, but it quickly corrected, its turret locking onto him. Jude sprang out from cover, firing again. His shot hit the drone's turret, disabling it. The machine sparked and whined before crashing to the floor, its lights flickering out. Finn let out a shaky breath, his hand still on the terminal. "I'm in. I looped the cameras. We've got a window, but it won't last long." "Then we move now," Jude said, motioning for the group to follow. They moved quickly, the sound of the drone still ringing in their ears. The tunnel sloped downward, the air growing hotter and heavier with every step. The hum of machinery was almost deafening now, and the walls glowed faintly with a pale blue light. Finally, the tunnel opened into a massive chamber, and the group froze, their breaths catching in their throats. The room was filled with towering machines, their surfaces sleek and metallic, pulsing with the same blue light. Tubes and cables snaked across the floor, connecting the machines to a central platform. On the platform stood a massive cylindrical device that glowed with an otherworldly energy. Inside the device, suspended in a column of light, was a figure. A man, his body limp and lifeless, his face twisted in agony. The blue light pulsed around him, growing brighter with each beat until it seemed to flow into the machine itself. Finn's voice was barely a whisper. "What is this?" "The sacrifices," Caleb said, his voice hollow. "This is how the city survives." Jude's grip tightened on his rifle, his mind racing. The clean city wasn't salvation. It was a machine, feeding on the lives of the desperate to keep itself alive. "We can't stay here," Jude said, his voice firm. "We find another terminal, get what we need, and get out." "And then what?" Reed asked, his voice shaking. "We can't fight this. Look at it." "We don't have to fight it," Jude said. "We just have to survive it." As they turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed through the chamber. Jude's heart sank as he saw them, guards, armed and armored, moving toward them with military precision. "Run!" Jude said, his voice low but urgent. The group bolted, their footsteps echoing through the chamber as the guards shouted orders behind them. The clean city had revealed its true face, and there was no going back. Chapter 9. Hunted. Jude's legs burned as he sprinted through the twisting maintenance tunnels, the echo of boots and shouted orders growing louder behind them. The guards were closing in, their voices crackling over comms, coordinated and precise. The flickering light of the tunnel painted shifting shadows on the walls, making it feel as though the city itself was alive and chasing them. "Keep moving," Jude shouted over his shoulder. Brock led the way, dragging the sled as though it weighed nothing, his massive frame brushing the narrow walls. Finn ran close behind him, clutching his toolkit, his breaths ragged but determined. Caleb stumbled, and Reed grabbed his arm, pulling him upright with a growl of frustration. "They're right behind us," Reed barked. "We're not going to make it if we keep dragging this guy along." "We don't leave anyone behind," Jude snapped, glancing back just in time to see the faint glint of a rifle barrel rounding the corner. The first shot rang out, a sharp crack that ricocheted off the walls. Jude ducked instinctively, firing a quick burst in return. The guards weren't phased. They moved like a machine, methodical and relentless. "Finn, can you slow them down?" Jude asked as he fired another shot. "Give me a second," Finn shouted, skidding to a halt beside a control panel embedded in the wall. His fingers flew over the touchscreen, sparks flying as he bypassed the system. The hum of machinery shifted, and a heavy grinding sound filled the air. Behind them, A large section of the tunnel's ceiling collapsed with a deafening crash, filling the passage with rubble and cutting off the guards' advance. "Go!" Finn yelled, bolting after the group. They didn't stop running, the air growing hotter and thicker as they descended deeper into the city's infrastructure. The tunnel opened into another massive chamber, this one dominated by a network of pipes and conduits that snaked upward toward the dome. The blue light was brighter here, pulsing in rhythmic waves that seemed almost alive. Jude motioned for the group to stop, his chest heaving as he scanned the room. "We can't outrun them forever. We need a plan." Reed slumped against the wall, glaring at Jude. "You've got us running straight into the lion's den, and now you want a plan? Great leadership." "Shut up, Reed," Brock growled, stepping between them. "We need to hide," Finn said, his voice trembling. "At least until we figure out what's next." Jude nodded, his mind racing. The room was large enough to provide cover, but the guards would eventually find them. He glanced at Caleb, who was leaning heavily against the wall, his face pale. "Caleb, what's deeper in?" Jude asked. "What's past this chamber?" Caleb shook his head weakly. "Deeper levels. Security gets tighter. If we go further down, we'll be trapped." "We're already trapped," Jude said. "We just need to make sure we're not sitting ducks." Finn pointed toward a cluster of pipes near the far wall. "There's a gap over there. If we can wedge ourselves in, we might buy some time." "Let's move," Jude said. "Quietly." The group crept toward the pipes, their footsteps muffled by the hum of machinery. Jude's heart pounded as they squeezed into the narrow gap, the metal cool against his back. The pulsing blue light reflected faintly off their faces, casting an eerie glow. They waited, the sound of boots and muffled voices growing louder. The guards had cleared the rubble and were closing in fast. Jude gripped his rifle tightly, every nerve in his body screaming at him to run, to fight, to do something. Through the gap, he saw them, 5 guards in sleek black armor, their helmets obscuring their faces. They moved in formation, sweeping the room with precision. One of them paused, scanning the floor where the group had been moments before. Jude held his breath, his finger hovering over the trigger. The guard took a step closer, his rifle raised. A loud hiss filled the chamber and one of the pipes behind the guards burst, spewing steam and filling the air with a blinding mist. Jude didn't hesitate. "Go!" he shouted, shoving Finn forward and firing a burst of shots into the mist. The guards shouted in confusion, their voices distorted by the steam. The group bolted, weaving through the labyrinth of pipes and machinery. The steam gave them cover, but it wouldn't last. Jude could hear the guards regrouping, their boots pounding against the metal floor. The tunnel ahead narrowed, the walls closing in until it was barely wide enough for Brock to squeeze through with the sled. The blue light grew brighter, almost blinding, and the hum of machinery became a deafening roar. Jude skidded to a halt as they emerged into another chamber. This one was smaller but more sinister. The walls were lined with cylindrical tanks filled with glowing blue liquid, each one containing a figure suspended inside. Their faces were obscured, but their contorted forms told the story. These were the sacrifices. Finn's voice was barely audible over the hum. What is this?" "This is how they do it," Caleb said, his voice trembling. "This is where they drain them." Reed took a step back, shaking his head. "We're not supposed to be here. This isn't something we're supposed to see." Jude ignored him, moving toward the nearest tank. The figure inside was a young man, his body limp, his eyes half open as the blue light pulsed around him. The energy seemed to flow from his chest, through the cables, and into the walls. "We need to keep moving," Jude said, his voice tight. "We can't do anything for them right now." Finn hesitated, his eyes fixed on the tanks. "Jude, this is wrong. We can't just leave them." "We don't have a choice," Jude said, pulling him away. "If we don't get out of here, we'll end up in one of those tanks." The sound of boots echoed through the tunnel behind them. The guards were close. Jude motioned for the group to follow, his heart pounding as they disappeared into the next passage. The sacrifices haunted him. Their glowing forms burned into his mind. The clean city wasn't salvation. It was a machine, and they were all just fuel. Chapter 10. Collapse. The hum of the machinery grew louder as the group stumbled through the dimly lit tunnels, their breath ragged and hearts pounding. Jude led the way, his rifle raised and his mind racing. Behind him, Finn clutched his toolkit, his eyes wide with terror. Brock hauled the sled without complaint, his massive frame moving with surprising speed. Caleb leaned heavily against the wall, barely keeping pace, while Reed brought up the rear, his face pale and drawn. The guards were closing in. Their shouts echoed down the tunnel, the sharp clicks of their boots growing louder with every step. Jude knew they didn't have much time. "This way!" he shouted, motioning toward a narrow side passage that sloped downward. The group turned sharply, the blue glow of the tunnel lights reflecting off their masks as they plunged deeper into the city's bowels. Finn stumbled, nearly falling, and Brock caught him with one hand, pulling him upright. "You all right?" Brock asked, his voice low and calm. Finn nodded shakily. "Yeah, just keep moving." The passage opened into another chamber, smaller than the others, but filled with more of the glowing tanks. Each one held a figure suspended in blue light, their bodies limp and lifeless as the energy was drained from them. The sight made Jude's stomach churn, but he forced himself to look away. "We need to disable this," Finn said suddenly, his voice trembling. "If we don't, they'll just keep doing it. They'll keep taking people." Jude hesitated, glancing back at the way they'd come. The sound of the guards was closer now, their voices sharp and urgent. "We don't have time." "We have to make time," Finn said, stepping toward one of the tanks. "This isn't just about us. It's about stopping this, whatever this is." "He's right," Caleb said, his voice weak but resolute. "If we don't do something, more people will die." Reed let out a bitter laugh. "You're all insane. You think we're going to take down the whole city with what? A tool kit and a shotgun?" "We don't need to take down the city," Jude said, his mind racing. "We just need to disrupt this system. If we can damage it enough, it might buy people time to escape." Finn was already at the nearest terminal, his fingers flying over the keys. "I can overload the system, but it's going to draw attention. A lot of attention." "Do it," Jude said. He turned to Brock. "Get ready to hold them off." Brock nodded, his shotgun already in his hands. He positioned himself near the entrance to the chamber, his broad shoulders blocking most of the passage. Reed reluctantly joined him, muttering under his breath. Jude moved to Finn's side, watching as the younger man worked. The terminal screen flickered, displaying lines of code and diagrams that meant nothing to Jude. "How long?" he asked. "Couple minutes," Finn said, his voice tight with concentration. "This system's old, but it's complicated. If I push too hard, it might shut me out." "Just do what you can," Jude said. The first guard appeared in the passage, his rifle raised. Brock fired, the shotgun's roar deafening in the confined space. The guard dropped, but more were right behind him. Reed fired wildly, his shots ricocheting off the walls. "We've got company!" Reed shouted, his voice panicked. "Hold them off!" Jude barked, raising his own rifle and firing at the advancing guards. The chamber filled with the deafening echoes of gunfire, the blue glow of the tanks casting eerie shadows on the walls. "I'm almost there!" Finn shouted over the noise. A bullet whizzed past Jude's head and he ducked behind a console, returning fire. Caleb crouched nearby, his face pale but determined. "What happens if we blow this place?" Caleb asked, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Jude didn't answer. He didn't know. All he could think about was stopping the system, stopping the sacrifices. "I've got it!" Finn shouted, his voice triumphant. "Overloading now." The tanks began to shudder, the blue light inside them pulsing erratically. The hum of the machinery grew into a deafening roar, and the floor beneath their feet vibrated violently. Sparks flew from the cables, and the figures inside the tanks twitched as the energy flow faltered. "What the hell is happening?" Reed shouted, his eyes wide with panic. "Time to go!" Jude yelled, grabbing Finn by the arm and pulling him away from the terminal. "Brock, fall back!" The big man fired one last shot before retreating, his movement steady and controlled despite the chaos. Reed hesitated, glancing back at the advancing guards, then followed, his face pale. The group ran as the chamber began to collapse around them. Tanks shattered, spilling blue light and liquid onto the floor. The walls cracked, and chunks of debris rained down from above. The roar of the machinery reached a crescendo, drowning out everything else. They burst into the next passage just as the chamber behind them imploded, sending a shockwave that knocked them off their feet. Jude scrambled to his knees, his ears ringing, and helped Finn to his feet. "You okay?" Jude asked. Finn nodded, his face pale but determined. "Yeah. Let's keep moving." They didn't stop running until the sounds of the collapse faded behind them. The tunnel opened into a wide, dark space, and Jude slowed, his chest heaving as he scanned the area. "We're clear," he said, his voice hoarse. "For now." The group slumped to the ground, their exhaustion evident. Brock leaned against the wall, his shotgun resting across his knees. Reed sat with his head in his hands while Caleb collapsed onto the floor, his breathing shallow. Finn sat beside Jude, his face lit faintly by the glow of his mask. "Did we do it? Did we stop it?" Jude didn't answer immediately. He stared back at the tunnel, the faint blue glow still visible in the distance. "We bought time," he said finally, "but this isn't over." Caleb coughed weakly, drawing their attention. "You might have disrupted the system," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But Viktor won't stop. He'll rebuild." "Let him try," Jude said, his voice hard. "We'll be ready." The group sat in silence, the weight of what they'd done settling over them. The clean city wasn't the salvation they'd hoped for, but it wasn't impenetrable. They'd seen its cracks, and they'd survive long enough to widen them. Jude stared into the darkness ahead, his resolve hardening. They weren't just running anymore, they were fighting, and they wouldn't stop until the clean city fell. Chapter 11, Fault Lines. The tunnel ahead was pitch black, the faint hum of machinery drowned out by the ringing in Jude's ears. The group's breaths were heavy, their exhaustion palpable as they pressed on. Finn walked beside Jude, his head down and his steps shaky. Brock dragged the sled behind him, each scrape of the wheels echoing in the confined space. No one spoke for what felt like hours. The collapse of the energy extraction chamber had bought them time, but Jude knew it was fleeting. Viktor wouldn't let this stand. He'd send more guards, more drones, more everything to hunt them down. The clean city wasn't just a machine, it was an organism, and now they'd wounded it. "Are we just going to keep running forever?" Reed finally said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Because that worked out real well so far." Jude ignored him, focusing on the faint light ahead. The tunnel began to slope upward, the air growing cooler as they climbed. "We can't keep this pace," Caleb said, his voice hoarse. "We need rest." "Rest and we're sitting ducks," Reed shot back. "You saw what they sent after us. They're not going to stop until we're all strapped to one of those tanks." "Shut it, Reed," Jude said, his voice sharp. "We'll rest when it's safe." "If it's safe," Reed muttered under his breath. The tunnel opened into a small maintenance room, its walls lined with rusted lockers and dusty control panels. A single overhead light flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the room. Jude motioned for the group to stop. 10 minutes, he said. "No more." Brock lowered the sled carefully, leaning against the wall with a tired grunt. Finn sat on the floor, pulling out his toolkit and inspecting his equipment with shaking hands. Caleb collapsed onto a crate, his face pale and drawn. Reed paced near the doorway, his pistol tucked into his belt. 10 minutes isn't gonna fix this mess. Neither is whining, Jude said, his tone flat. Reed shot him a glare, but didn't argue. Jude knelt beside Finn, his voice low. How are you holding up? Finn gave a weak smile, his fingers still fidgeting with a piece of broken wiring. I've been better, but I'll manage. You did good back there, Jude said. That overload bought us time. Finn nodded, though his eyes didn't meet Jude's. It's not enough, though, is it? They'll fix it, rebuild it. Maybe, Jude said, but we made a dent. That's more than most people can say. Finn looked at him, his expression conflicted. What happens now? Jude didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the others, Reed pacing, Brock cleaning his shotgun, Caleb barely holding himself upright. They were running on fumes, but they couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. We find a way out of the city, Jude said finally, and then we figure out our next move. Reed laughed bitterly. Out of the city? Great plan. You know, I'm starting to think you don't have any idea what you're doing. Keep talking, Reed, Jude said, his voice low and dangerous. See how far it gets you. Before Reed could respond, a faint sound echoed down the tunnel. A distant mechanical whirring that sent a chill down Jude's spine. Drones, Caleb whispered, his face pale. Jude stood, his rifle already in his hands. Everyone up, now. The group scrambled to their feet, their exhaustion forgotten as adrenaline kicked in. Finn stuffed his tools back into his pack while Brock grabbed the sled and hefted it onto his shoulder. Which way? Reed asked, his voice tense. Up, Jude said, pointing to a staircase in the corner of the room. Move! They climbed the stairs quickly, the sound of the drones growing louder with each step. The passage opened into a larger tunnel, this one lined with pipes that glowed faintly with the same blue light they'd seen in the tanks. The hum of energy was almost deafening here, vibrating through the walls and the floor. Jude led the group down the tunnel, his rifle raised. The light ahead grew brighter, and he slowed, motioning for the others to stop. Stay here, he whispered, moving forward cautiously. The tunnel opened into a massive circular chamber. In the center of the room stood a towering machine, its surface sleek and metallic, pulsing with blue energy. Surrounding it were rows of consoles and terminals, each manned by figures in dark uniforms. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their weapons slung across their chests. Jude's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a machine. It was the heart of the clean city, the core that powered everything. And it was protected like a fortress. He backed away slowly, returning to the group. We found it. Found what? Finn asked. The core, Jude said. The thing that keeps this whole city running. Reed's eyes widened. And what? You want to blow that up too? It's an option, Jude said. It's suicide, Reed shot back. We barely made it out of that last place alive. You think we're going to take this thing down? Jude ignored him, turning to Finn. Can you shut it down? Finn hesitated, glancing toward the chamber. Maybe, but I'd need access to one of those terminals. And even if I can, it'll take time. Time we don't have, Caleb said, his voice weak. We don't need time, Jude said, his mind racing. We just need a distraction. He turned to Brock. You and Reed take the left side, cause as much chaos as you can. Finn and I will get to a terminal and shut this thing down. Reed shook his head. You're insane. Probably, Jude said. But it's better than waiting to die. Before Reed could argue, the sound of footsteps echoed down the tunnel. The guards were moving, their comms crackling faintly. Jude motioned for the group to move, his grip tightening on his rifle. Let's go, he said, his voice hard. The clean city's heart was within reach, and Jude wasn't leaving without a fight. Chapter 12. Heart of the Machine. The hum of the clean city's core reverberated through the chamber, a steady mechanical heartbeat that sent vibrations through the walls. Jude pressed his back against the cold metal of the tunnel entrance, his rifle tight in his hands. The sight of the massive core, pulsing with blue energy, was etched into his mind. This was the city's lifeline, and possibly their death sentence. Finn crouched beside him, his breath shallow as he clutched his toolkit. Across the chamber, Brock and Reed crept toward the left side, staying low behind a series of consoles. The guards patrolled in tight formations, their movements sharp and practiced. "Wait for my signal," Jude whispered into the small radio clipped to his jacket. Brock gave a single nod in response, his massive frame hidden behind a pipe. Jude glanced at Finn. "You ready?" Finn swallowed hard, his face pale but determined. "As ready as I'll ever be." "Stay close," Jude said, "and don't stop moving." Finn nodded, his grip tightening on his toolkit. Jude turned his attention back to the guards, counting their steps, waiting for the perfect moment. When one of them paused to check a console, Jude raised his hand. "Now!" Brock sprang into action, stepping out of cover and firing his shotgun. The blast echoed through the chamber, sending one of the guards sprawling. Reed followed, his pistol barking as he fired at another guard. Chaos erupted as the patrol scrambled for cover, shouting orders into their comms. Jude grabbed Finn's arm and pulled him forward. They darted between consoles and pipes, staying low as bullets whizzed past them. Finn stumbled but kept moving, his eyes wide with fear. "Over here," Jude said, leading him to a terminal on the far side of the chamber. He crouched beside it, scanning for more guards. "Do your thing." Finn opened his toolkit and began working, his fingers flying over the console's keys. Sparks flew as he pried open a panel, exposing a tangle of wires. "This system is ancient," he muttered, "but it's layered. They've got redundancies everywhere." "How long?" Jude asked, his eyes fixed on the guards. 5 minutes, maybe less." "We don't have 5 minutes," Jude said. "Make it 3. Finn gritted his teeth but didn't argue, his hands moving faster. Across the chamber, Brock fired again, his shotgun booming as another guard fell. Reed crouched behind a console, his shots less precise but keeping the guards pinned down. The core's hum grew louder, the pulsing light reflecting off the chaos. Jude leaned out from behind the terminal and fired at a guard who had broken from cover. The man dropped, his rifle clattering to the floor. Jude ducked back as another shot rang out, narrowly missing him. "Hurry up, Finn," Jude said. "I'm going as fast as I can." Finn snapped, sweat beading on his forehead. One of the guards threw something, a small black device that landed near the console. Jude recognized it instantly. "Grenade!" he shouted, grabbing Finn and pulling him back. The explosion rocked the chamber, sending sparks and debris flying. The console Finn had been working on was destroyed, its screen shattered and wires sparking. Finn coughed, his face streaked with soot. "It's gone! I can't—" "Find another one," Jude said, pulling him to his feet. "Now." Finn scrambled to the next terminal, his hand shaking as he opened the panel. Jude fired at another guard, forcing him back into cover. 2 minutes, Finn shouted. "If I can bypass this last layer—" "You'll get your 2 minutes, Jude said, reloading his rifle. He leaned out and fired again, covering Finn as the boy worked. Brock's voice crackled over the radio. "We've got more incoming, reinforcements coming down the tunnel." "Hold them off as long as you can," Jude said. "We're almost there." "I'm trying," Brock growled, the sound of his shotgun punctuating his words. Reed's panicked voice followed. "They're gonna overwhelm us. We need to get out of here." "Shut up and keep firing," Jude snapped. Finn's fingers flew over the console, his movements frantic but precise. The hum of the core grew louder, the pulsing light flickering erratically. Jude glanced at the machine, its blue glow dimming slightly. "Almost there," Finn muttered. "Almost? Got it." The core's hum faltered, its light dimming further. The massive machine shuddered, and the entire chamber seemed to tremble. Alarms blared, red lights flashing across the room. "What's happening?" Jude asked, I triggered a cascade failure, Finn said, his voice trembling. It's shutting down, but it's going to take the entire system with it. We need to go, now. Jude grabbed Finn's arm and pulled him toward the exit. Brock, Reed, fall back. We're done here. Brock's shotgun roared one last time before he retreated, his massive frame shielding Reed as they ran. The guards regrouped, their shouts drowned out by the blaring alarms. The group sprinted through the tunnel, the ground shaking beneath their feet. Pipes burst, spewing steam and sparks, and the walls cracked as the system began to collapse. The hum of the core was replaced by a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to come from the city itself. Keep moving, Jude shouted, pushing Finn ahead of him. They burst into the open air, the dome's perimeter just ahead. Behind them, the ground buckled, and a plume of blue energy shot into the sky, lighting up the ash-filled horizon. The clean city shuddered, its once pristine surface cracking as the core's collapse rippled outward. The group didn't stop until they were well beyond the city's edge. They collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, their bodies covered in ash and sweat. Jude sat up, his chest heaving as he looked back at the city. The dome was still standing, but its surface was scarred, the blue light inside flickering faintly. The clean city wasn't dead, but it was wounded, badly. We did it, Finn said, his voice barely above a whisper. For now, Jude said, his voice grim. But they'll rebuild. Viktor won't let this stand. Then what was the point? Reed asked, his tone bitter. Jude turned to him, his eyes hard. The point was to show them they're not invincible, and to buy everyone else a chance. Reed didn't respond, his gaze dropping to the ground. Jude looked back at the city, his jaw tight. They had survived this fight, but the war was far from over, and he wasn't done yet. Chapter 13. Aftershocks. The clean city's dome stood in the distance, scarred and flickering like a wounded beast. The blue glow that had once been a beacon of its power was now dim and erratic, sending fractured light into the ash-filled sky. Jude sat on the edge of a crumbling concrete foundation, his rifle resting across his lap, watching the city as the rest of the group caught their breath. Finn was huddled nearby, his head resting on his knees, his toolkit abandoned at his side. Brock leaned against a rusted pillar, reloading his shotgun with the slow precision of a man who'd done it 1,000 times. Caleb lay flat on the ground, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, while Reed paced in tight circles, muttering curses under his breath. Jude took a swig from his canteen, the water tasting stale but welcome. His muscles ached, his lungs burned, and his mind churned with what they'd just done. The clean city's core was damaged, its system disrupted. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Reed's voice broke the silence. We're dead. You know that, right? They'll send everything they have after us now. Jude didn't look at him. They were already coming after us. Yeah, but now they've got a reason, Reed snapped. We didn't just poke the bear, we set it on fire. Brock's deep voice rumbled. Better than rolling over and dying. Reed glared at him. Yeah, sure. Let's keep pissing off the people with the drones and the tanks and the clean air. Great plan. Enough, Jude said, his tone sharp. Arguing isn't going to help. We've got to keep moving. Moving where? Reed asked, throwing up his hands. There's nowhere to go. We're out of filters, out of food, and out of time. Jude stood, his eyes locking with Reed's. Then we make time. We find more supplies. We figure it out. Reed laughed bitterly. You don't even know what we're doing anymore, do you? You're just making it up as you go. Jude stepped closer, his voice low and cold. We're alive, aren't we? That's more than most people can say. Reed didn't respond, his jaw tightening as he looked away. Brock shifted, his voice calm, but firm. We've come this far. No sense stopping now. Jude glanced at the horizon. The Ashstorm had settled, leaving the world in an eerie, gray stillness. They couldn't stay here long. The Clean City's enforcers would already be tracking them. He turned to Finn, who hadn't moved. "How's the system holding up?" Finn lifted his head slightly, his face pale. "Filters are holding for now, but we're burning through them fast. We'll need replacements soon." "Then that's our next priority," Jude said. "We find supplies, regroup, and figure out our next move." Reed scoffed. "Yeah, sure, let's just pop into the nearest store and grab some filters. Easy." Jude ignored him, looking at Caleb. "How are you holding up?" Caleb managed a weak smile. "Still breathing. That's something." "Barely," Reed muttered. But this time no one responded. They set out again, heading west into the ruins. The ground was uneven, covered in broken concrete and jagged metal, remnants of a world that no longer existed. The ash hung in the air like a ghost, clinging to their clothes and masks. Jude kept his rifle ready, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. The Clean City might have been damaged, but its reach extended far beyond the dome. He didn't trust the silence. Finn walked beside him, his steps slow but steady. "Do you think we really hurt them? The city, I mean." "We hurt them," Jude said, "but not enough to stop them." "Then why'd we do it?" Finn asked, his voice quiet. "Because we had to," Jude said. "Because someone had to." Finn nodded, though his expression remained troubled. Jude understood the feeling. The weight of what they'd seen, the sacrifices, the tanks, the endless blue light, wasn't something that would go away easily. By late afternoon, they reached what had once been a shopping district. The buildings were crumbling, their windows shattered, their walls covered in ash and grime. Jude motioned for the group to stop, raising a hand for silence. "Stay close," he said, "and keep your eyes open." They moved cautiously through the ruins, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. Jude's senses were on high alert, every shadow and sound making his finger tighten on the trigger. He motioned for Finn to check one of the buildings, while Brock and Caleb stayed outside with the sled. Reed followed Jude into what had once been a hardware store. The shelves were mostly empty, their contents looted long ago, but Jude scanned the room carefully. "Look for anything useful. Tools, filters, anything." Reed muttered something under his breath but started searching. Jude moved toward the back of the store, stepping over broken glass and debris. He opened a cabinet and found a small stash of batteries, their packaging faded but intact. "Batteries," he called out, tossing them into his bag. "Great. Now we just need a flashlight and a way out of this nightmare," Reed said, kicking over a pile of rubble. Jude ignored him, moving to another shelf. He found a cracked mask and a half-empty box of filters. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Found some filters," he said. "Not enough, but—" The sound of footsteps outside cut him off. Jude froze, his rifle snapping up instinctively. He moved to the window and peered out, his breath catching in his throat. 3 figures were moving through the ruins, their movement sharp and deliberate. They wore the sleek black uniforms of the Clean City's enforcers, their masks glowing faintly in the ash-filled light. "We've got company," Jude said, his voice low. Reed's face paled. "You think they're looking for us?" "Probably," Jude said. "Let's move." They slipped out the back of the store, rejoining the others. Jude motioned for the group to stay low as the enforcers approached. The figures moved with precision, scanning the area with handheld devices that glowed faintly blue. "They're tracking something," Finn whispered. "Us," Jude said. "They're tracking us." Reed cursed under his breath. "This is your fault, you know that?" "Quiet," Jude snapped. He pointed to a narrow alleyway between 2 buildings. "We'll slip through there. Stay close." The group moved quickly, sticking to the shadows. The enforcers didn't seem to notice them, their attention focused on the devices. Jude led the way, his rifle ready, his heart pounding. They were still being hunted, but for now, they were alive. And as long as they were alive, there was still a chance. Chapter 14. The Hunter's Shadow. The narrow alley pressed them close together, the group moving in tense silence as they slipped between crumbling walls. Jude led the way, his rifle ready, his steps measured. Finn walked just behind him, clutching his toolkit tightly, while Brock dragged the sled with quiet efficiency. Reed's pacing was frantic, his muttered complaints rising just above the sound of their footsteps. Caleb lagged, his breath labored, but he kept up as best he could. Jude slowed, motioning for the group to stop as they reached the end of the alley. Beyond the jagged opening was a wider street, the skeletal remains of buildings looming on either side. The ash was thicker here, clinging to every surface, and the light was dim, filtered through the ever-present haze. Jude scanned the area, his gaze sharp. The enforcers would be close by now, their tracking devices drawing them like wolves to wounded prey. Finn stepped up beside him, his voice low. "What do we do if they find us?" "We make sure they don't," Jude said. He turned to the others. "We cross fast, stay low, and keep quiet. Brock, you take point with the sled. I'll cover the rear." Reed scoffed. "Yeah, because sneaking worked so well the last time." "Shut up and move," Jude said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Brock nodded and stepped into the street, his massive frame moving with surprising stealth as he guided the sled over uneven ground. Finn followed close behind, his head low, while Caleb shuffled along, his hand gripping the sled for balance. Jude waited for Reed to move, his eyes scanning the shadows. When the group was halfway across, Jude stepped out, his rifle raised. The sound came suddenly, a faint, mechanical whirring that made the hairs on the back of Jude's neck stand up. He froze, his gaze snapping toward the far end of the street. Through the ash and haze, a sleek black drone hovered into view, its glowing sensors sweeping the area. "Drone," Jude said, his voice sharp but quiet. "Get down." The group dropped to the ground, pressing themselves against the rubble. Jude knelt, his rifle trained on the drone. Its movements were deliberate, scanning each corner, its sensors glowing faintly blue. Jude's finger hovered over the trigger, his breath steady, waiting for the perfect shot. The drone's sensors swept past the group, and for a moment, it seemed to hesitate. Then with a faint whir, it turned and moved away, disappearing into the haze. Jude didn't lower his rifle until the sound faded completely. "Go," he said, motioning for the group to move. They hurried across the street and into the cover of another alley, their movements quick and quiet. Jude took a deep breath, his heart still pounding, and looked back to ensure they weren't being followed. Finn leaned against a crumbling wall, his face pale. That was too close. "It's going to get closer," Caleb said, his voice strained. "They're not just tracking us, they're hurting us." Reed turned to him, his face tight with frustration. "What the hell are you talking about?" "They're steering us," Caleb said, his gaze distant. "Toward something. Toward Viktor." "Why would they do that?" Finn asked. "Because he wants us alive," Caleb said. "At least for now." Jude frowned, his grip tightening on his rifle. He didn't like the idea of being someone's prey, but Caleb's words rang true. The enforcers could have taken them out by now if they'd wanted to. Instead, they were driving them somewhere. "We're not playing his game," Jude said. "We're finding another way out." Reed laughed bitterly. "Oh, great. Another brilliant plan from our fearless leader." Jude ignored him, his mind racing. The enforcers were closing in, and they couldn't stay on the run forever. He glanced at Finn. "Any idea how they're tracking us?" Finn hesitated, then nodded. "It's the masks. They have sensors built into them. It's how they track air quality. But if the city's tied into the system, they could be using them to trace our location." "Can you disable them?" Jude asked. Finn frowned, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Maybe. But if I do, we lose our filtration. Without it, the ash will kill us." We don't need to disable all of them, Caleb said, his voice quiet but firm. Just one. Throw them off the trail. Jude considered the idea. If they left one mask behind, still active, it might lead the enforcers in the wrong direction. It was a gamble, but it was better than waiting to be caught. All right, Jude said. Finn, disable one mask and leave it here. Make it look like we dropped it. Finn nodded and quickly got to work, pulling one of the spare masks from the sled and prying it open with his tools. Sparks flew as he rewired the sensors, his movements quick and precise. When he finished, he placed the mask on the ground and stepped back. That should do it, Finn said. It'll give off a signal for a while before it shuts down completely. Let's move, Jude said. The group continued through the alleys, their movements cautious and deliberate. The city's ruins stretched endlessly, the ash filling every corner, every crevice. The enforcers' presence lingered, an unseen weight pressing down on them. But for now, the trail seemed to grow colder. As they reached the edge of the ruins, Jude stopped and turned to the group. We'll camp here for the night. Stay sharp. They're still out there. No one argued. They were too tired, too drained to protest. Brock set the sled down carefully, while Finn and Caleb sank to the ground, their bodies slumped with exhaustion. Reed leaned against a broken wall, his face tight with barely contained anger. Jude sat with his back to the wall, his rifle resting across his lap. His eyes scanned the horizon, watching for any sign of movement. The clean city loomed in the distance, its scarred dome barely visible through the haze. Viktor's shadow stretched long, but for now they had bought themselves time, and time was all they needed. Chapter 15. Desperate Measures. The night settled over the ruins like a heavy blanket, muffling sound and stretching shadows. The group huddled in silence, the ash swirling faintly in the dim light of their masks. Jude sat with his back to a crumbled wall, his rifle resting across his lap, his eyes fixed on the clean city's distant dome. The faint flickering glow of its damaged core was still visible through the haze, a reminder of the damage they'd done. But the city wasn't finished with them yet. Brock sat nearby, methodically cleaning his shotgun, his massive hands moving with a calm precision that belied the tension in the air. Finn had his back to the sled, his eyes half closed as he toyed with a broken circuit board. Caleb lay on the ground, his breathing shallow, while Reed stood at the edge of the camp, pacing in tight, angry circles. "This is pointless," Reed muttered, his voice cutting through the silence. "We're sitting ducks out here." Jude didn't respond. He had learned long ago that Reed's complaints didn't require answers. Instead, he kept his focus on the horizon, scanning for any signs of movement. The enforcers were out there somewhere, tracking them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Reed stopped pacing, turning to face Jude. "You hear me? We're wasting time. We need to keep moving." "And head straight into another ambush?" Jude said, his voice calm but firm. "We've done enough running. We need to rest and regroup." "Rest!" Reed snapped, his frustration boiling over. "We don't have time to rest. You think Viktor's just going to let us walk away after what we did? He's probably already—" "Enough," Brock said, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "You're not helping." Reed glared at him but didn't argue. Instead, he turned and kicked a loose piece of rubble, sending it skittering across the ground. Finn spoke up, his voice quiet. "If we keep running without a plan, we're just going to wear ourselves out. And then they'll pick us off, one by one." "Smart kid," Brock said, nodding. Reed scoffed but said nothing. He sank down onto a broken slab of concrete, his face tight with anger. Jude turned to Caleb, who was leaning weakly against the sled. "How are you holding up?" Caleb managed a faint smile. "Still breathing. That's about all I can say." "We'll get through this," Jude said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. He turned his gaze back to the horizon, the weight of their situation pressing heavily on his shoulders. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint hum of the clean city in the distance. Jude's mind churned with possibilities, each one more desperate than the last. They couldn't outrun Viktor forever. Sooner or later, they would have to face him. "We need leverage," Jude said suddenly, breaking the silence. Finn looked up, frowning. "Leverage? Against Viktor?" Jude nodded. "Something we can use to level the playing field. Right now, he has all the power. We need to change that." Reed laughed bitterly. "And where exactly are we supposed to find leverage? You think he's just going to hand us a bargaining chip?" "No," Jude said, his tone hard. "But there's something in that city, something they don't want anyone to see. That's why they're hunting us. They're afraid of what we know." "What we know?" Reed said, shaking his head. "We don't know anything." "Not yet," Jude said. He turned to Finn. "If we can find a way back into the city, get into their systems, we might be able to expose them. Show the rest of the world what's really happening in there." Finn's eyes widened. "You're talking about getting evidence, proof of the sacrifices." Jude nodded. "Exactly. If we can show people what the clean city is built on, Viktor's power crumbles." "That's assuming we survive long enough to get it," Reed said, "and that anyone out there cares." "They'll care," Jude said. "Because if we don't stop Viktor, this won't end with the clean city. He'll expand, take more land, more people. He'll turn the whole world into his machine." The group fell silent, the weight of Jude's words settling over them. Even Reed didn't argue this time. Finally, Caleb spoke, his voice weak but resolute. "If you're going back into the city, you'll need a way in, and you'll need someone who knows the layout." Jude looked at him, his expression unreadable. "You're volunteering?" Caleb nodded slowly. "I've been there before. I know where the weak points are. If we're going to do this, I can help." "Are you sure you're up for it?" Jude asked. Caleb smiled faintly. "Not really, but I don't see much of a choice." Jude nodded, respect flickering in his eyes. "All right. We'll rest for a few hours, then we move." Reed groaned. "Back to the city? You're insane." "Maybe," Jude said, "but it's better than waiting to die." The group settled into an uneasy silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Jude leaned back against the wall, his rifle resting across his chest, his mind racing with the enormity of what lay ahead. The clean city was a fortress, but it wasn't invincible. They had seen its cracks, and now they would exploit them. As the night wore on, the distant glow of the city seemed to pulse in time with Jude's heartbeat. The path ahead was dangerous, but it was the only one they had. And if they were going to take Viktor down, they would need every ounce of courage, cunning, and determination they could muster. Because this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice. Chapter 16. A Way Back In. The ruins stretched into a gray void as the group prepared to move. Jude stood at the edge of their makeshift camp, scanning the faint glow of the clean city's dome in the distance. The air was cold, biting through his layers, but his focus was razor-sharp. They weren't running anymore. Now, they were going back into the lion's den. Caleb sat on the sled, his breathing steady but shallow. Despite his weakened state, there was a grim determination in his eyes. Brock secured the sled's straps, his massive hands moving with practiced efficiency. Finn checked his toolkit again, mumbling under his breath about the risks of tampering with city systems. Reed, predictably, was pacing. "This is suicide," Reed said, gesturing wildly at the horizon. "You realize that, right? We barely got out of there alive, and now you want to walk back in?" "It's not about what we want," Jude said, his voice calm but firm. "It's about what needs to be done." "What needs to be done is staying alive," Reed snapped. "We don't owe anyone anything. Let the city burn itself out. If it burns, it takes the rest of us with it, Jude said. He tightened his grip on his rifle, his gaze fixed on Reed. You don't have to come, but if you do, you follow my lead. Reed opened his mouth to argue but stopped, shaking his head as he muttered under his breath. Jude turned to Caleb. You said you know a way in. Let's hear it. Caleb nodded, pulling himself upright. There's an old maintenance route near the southern edge of the dome. It hasn't been used in years, but it's not sealed like the others. We can get in through there. How do you know it's still open? Brock asked. Because I used it to get out, Caleb said. They don't monitor it as heavily. Too close to the waste zones. Jude frowned. Waste zones? Caleb hesitated. The city doesn't just take from people. It leaves what's left behind. They dump it there. You'll see when we get close. Finn shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. This just keeps getting worse. Jude nodded grimly. Then we'd better be ready. Caleb, you lead the way. The group moved cautiously through the ruins, sticking to the shadows as they approached the city. The faint hum of machinery grew louder, mingling with the sound of distant drones patrolling the perimeter. Jude kept his rifle raised, scanning every corner for signs of movement. They reached the southern edge of the dome as the first light of dawn filtered through the ash-filled sky. The air here was thick with the acrid stench of decay, and the ground was uneven, littered with debris. Caleb motioned for the group to stop, pointing to a jagged opening in the ground. There, he said. The maintenance route. Jude crouched beside the opening, inspecting the narrow tunnel. It sloped downward, the walls lined with rusted metal and cables. The air inside was stale, carrying a faint metallic tang. Looks clear, Jude said, glancing back at the group. Finn, you're with me. Brock, bring up the sled. Caleb, guide us through. Reed, watch our six. Reed grumbled but nodded, his pistol at the ready. One by one, they descended into the tunnel, their footsteps echoing softly against the metal floor. The light from their masks cast eerie shadows on the walls, making the space feel even narrower. The hum of machinery grew louder as they went deeper, and the air grew warmer, tinged with the faint scent of burning oil. The tunnel opened into a wide chamber, its walls covered in pipes that glowed faintly blue. Pools of stagnant liquid dotted the floor, reflecting the pale light. Caleb pointed to a ladder on the far wall. That'll take us to the lower maintenance levels, he said. From there, we can access the main systems. Any chance we'll run into company? Jude asked. Always a chance, Caleb said. But they won't expect anyone to use this route. It's not part of their main patrols. That gives us an edge, Brock said, his voice low. Jude motioned for the group to move. Caleb climbed the ladder first, his movements slow but deliberate. Finn followed, then Brock with the sled, his massive frame barely squeezing through the narrow space. Jude brought up the rear, his rifle slung across his back, his every sense on high alert. The ladder led to another narrow passage, this one darker and quieter than the first. The walls were slick with condensation, and the air was heavy with moisture. Caleb led them forward, his steps careful but steady. This tunnel runs under the core, Caleb said. We can use it to access the city's central systems. If Finn can patch in, we might be able to download what we need. And if we can't? Reed asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Then we improvise, Jude said. He stopped suddenly, raising a hand for silence. A faint mechanical whir echoed down the passage, sending a chill down his spine. Drones, he whispered. They're scanning the tunnels. Finn's face went pale. What do we do? Hide, Jude said. He motioned for the group to press against the wall, their bodies blending into the shadows. The whir grew louder, the sound of spinning rotors filling the air. A sleek black drone floated into view, its sensors glowing faintly blue. It hovered in the center of the passage, its lights sweeping back and forth. Jude held his breath, his finger hovering over the trigger of his rifle. The drone lingered for a moment, then turned and floated away, its whirring sound fading into the distance. "Move," Jude said, his voice low but urgent. The group pressed on, their footsteps quick but silent. Every sound seemed amplified in the narrow space, every shadow a potential threat. They reached another junction, this one marked by a rusted sign that read, "Core Access, Authorized Personnel Only." "This is it," Caleb said. "Once we're in, we won't have much time before they know we're here." "We won't need much," Jude said, glancing at Finn. "You ready?" Finn nodded, his grip tightening on his toolkit. "Ready as I'll ever be." Jude turned to the others. "Stay sharp. This is where it gets dangerous." He pushed open the door, and the group stepped into the heart of the clean city's shadow. Chapter 17. Beneath the Beast. The air inside the core access tunnel was thick with heat and the faint tang of ozone. The walls glowed faintly, pulsing with the same blue energy that powered the clean city above. Jude led the way, his rifle raised, his every step calculated and silent. Behind him, Finn clutched his toolkit with white-knuckled hands, his face tense but determined. Brock followed, hauling the sled with quiet strength, while Caleb moved cautiously, his breathing labored but steady. Reed brought up the rear, muttering under his breath, his pistol clutched tightly. Jude's eyes scanned the tunnel ahead, his mind racing with every possibility. The faint hum of machinery filled the air, vibrating through the metal floor beneath their boots. Every sound seemed louder in the confined space. Their footsteps, their breathing, the occasional creak of the sled's wheels. Jude didn't trust the silence. The city wasn't asleep. It was watching. Finn stopped suddenly, his eyes fixed on a panel embedded in the wall. "There," he whispered, pointing. "That's a system interface. I might be able to access the city's network from here." Jude motioned for the group to stop, his voice low. "Do it, but keep it quick." Finn knelt by the panel, pulling out his tools and prying it open with careful precision. Sparks flew as he exposed the wires and began working, his fingers moving quickly over the terminal's keys. The faint glow of the screen illuminated his face, highlighting the beads of sweat that ran down his temples. "This system is old," Finn muttered, his voice barely audible. "But it's layered. They've got redundancies everywhere." "Can you bypass them?" Jude asked, keeping his eyes on the tunnel ahead. "Maybe," Finn said, "but it's going to take time." "Time we don't have," Reed hissed from the back, his voice sharp. "We're sitting ducks down here." "Then stay quiet," Jude snapped. He turned back to Finn. "Focus, we've got your back." Finn nodded, his hands working faster. Brock leaned against the wall, his shotgun resting casually in one hand, though his eyes were sharp, scanning the shadows for movement. Caleb sat on the sled, his face pale but resolute, while Reed paced nervously, his agitation growing with every passing second. The faint whir of a drone echoed down the tunnel, and Jude's heart skipped a beat. He raised his rifle, motioning for the group to take cover. Finn froze, his fingers hovering over the terminal, his face tense. The whir grew louder, the sound of rotors spinning in the confined space. Jude pressed himself against the wall, his rifle trained on the source of the noise. A sleek black drone floated into view, its sensors glowing faintly blue. It hovered in the center of the tunnel, scanning the area with methodical precision. Jude's finger hovered over the trigger, his breath steady. He waited, counting the seconds as the drone's light swept over their position. The tension in the air was suffocating, every muscle in Jude's body coiled like a spring. The drone lingered for a moment longer, then turned and floated away, its whirring sound fading into the distance. Jude exhaled slowly, lowering his rifle. "Keep going," he said, his voice low but firm. Finn nodded, his hands moving quickly as he resumed his work. The terminal beeped softly and Finn's eyes widened. "I'm in," he said, his voice a mix of relief and disbelief. "I've got access to their systems, Good, Jude said. What can you do? Finn's fingers flew over the keys, his eyes scanning the lines of code that filled the screen. I can access their surveillance network. Cameras, patrol routes, everything. If I can loop their feeds, we'll have a clear path to the core. Do it, Jude said. And find anything you can about Viktor. We need leverage. Finn nodded, his focus laser-sharp. The terminal's screen flickered as he worked, bypassing layers of security with quick, precise movements. Jude kept his rifle raised, his eyes fixed on the tunnel ahead. The faint hum of machinery grew louder, mingling with the tension that filled the air. I've got their patrol routes, Finn said. Looks like the main core chamber is heavily guarded, but there's a maintenance access point that leads directly to the central system. It's not monitored as closely. Can you shut down the guards? Jude asked. Finn shook his head. Not without triggering an alert, but I can disable some of their internal sensors. It'll give us a little breathing room. Do it, Jude said. And hurry. The terminal beeped again, and Finn's hands moved faster. Sparks flew as he rewired the system, his movements precise despite the pressure. Almost there, he muttered, his voice tense. The faint sound of footsteps echoed down the tunnel, and Jude's heart sank. He motioned for the group to take cover, his voice barely above a whisper. We've got company. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the faint crackle of voices over comms. Jude raised his rifle, his breath steady, his finger hovering over the trigger. The first enforcer appeared around the corner, his sleek black armor gleaming faintly in the blue light. Jude fired, the crack of his rifle echoing through the tunnel. The enforcer dropped, his weapon clattering to the ground. The others sprang into action, their movements sharp and precise. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, sending sparks flying as the group returned fire. Finn, how much longer? Jude shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. 30 seconds, Finn yelled, his hands moving frantically. Brock stepped forward, his shotgun booming as he fired at the advancing enforcers. The sound was deafening in the confined space, but it held the attackers back. Reed fired wildly, his shots less accurate but no less desperate. Caleb stayed low, his face pale as he clutched the sled. Done, Finn shouted, slamming the panel shut. I've looped the feeds. We've got a window, but it won't last long. Move! Jude barked, firing one last shot before retreating. The group bolted down the tunnel, their footsteps pounding against the metal floor. The hum of machinery grew louder, the walls vibrating with the energy of the core. They reached a heavy, reinforced door marked Core Access, Authorized Personnel Only. Finn stepped forward, pulling out his tools as he worked to bypass the lock. The terminal beside the door beeped softly, its lights flickering as Finn rewired the system. Hurry, Jude said, glancing back at the tunnel. The sound of footsteps and shouted orders echoed behind them, the enforcers closing in fast. Almost there, Finn said, his voice tight. The terminal beeped one last time and the door hissed open, revealing a narrow passage that led into the heart of the clean city. Jude motioned for the group to move, his rifle raised. The core was just ahead, and with it, the answers they'd been searching for. But the city wasn't going to let them take those answers without a fight. They stepped into the passage, the door hissing shut behind them, sealing them inside the beast. Chapter 18, The Core. The air inside the passage was thick and stifling, heavy with the hum of energy coursing through the walls. Jude led the way, his rifle raised, his every sense alert. Behind him, Finn clutched his toolkit tightly, his steps hurried but careful. Brock followed with the sled, his massive shoulders brushing against the narrow walls. Caleb moved just behind him, his breathing shallow but steady, while Reed lingered at the back, his pistol trembling in his hands. The passage opened into a massive chamber, and the sight made Jude stop in his tracks. The core of the clean city loomed before them, a towering cylindrical machine that pulsed with blue energy. Its surface was sleek and metallic, covered in cables and conduits that snaked across the floor and up the walls. The hum of its power was deafening, vibrating through the air like the heartbeat of a monstrous living thing. Around the core, dozens of terminals and consoles lined the walls, each manned by technicians in dark uniforms. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their weapons slung across their chests, their movements precise and deliberate. The room glowed with the faint, otherworldly light of the core, casting eerie shadows across the floor. Jude motioned for the group to stay low as they moved into the chamber. They crouched behind a series of crates, their breaths shallow as they surveyed the scene. Finn's eyes were wide with a mix of awe and terror as he whispered, "That's it. That's what powers the city." "And kills people to do it," Caleb added, his voice barely audible. "We can't take all of them," Reed hissed, his panic barely contained. "There's too many." "We're not here to fight them," Jude said, his voice firm but quiet. "We're here to shut this thing down." Finn glanced at the nearest console. "If I can get to that terminal, I might be able to access the core's systems, but I'll need time." "You'll get it," Jude said. He turned to Brock. "You and Reed cover us. Keep the guards off our backs." Brock nodded, his expression calm and focused. Reed, on the other hand, looked like he was about to argue, but the hard look in Jude's eyes silenced him. Jude motioned for Finn to move. The boy crept toward the terminal, his footsteps silent against the metallic floor. Jude followed close behind, his rifle trained on the guards as he scanned the room for any sign of movement. Finn reached the console and knelt beside it, opening his toolkit and prying open the panel with practiced ease. "I'm in," Finn whispered, his fingers flying over the terminal's keys. "This system's massive. It's going to take a minute to find the right access points." "Make it fast," Jude said, his voice low but urgent. He turned his attention back to the guards who continued their patrols, oblivious to the intruders. The hum of the core grew louder, its pulsing light flickering faintly as Finn worked. Sparks flew from the console as he bypassed layers of security, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I've got access to the core's subsystems," Finn said, his voice a mix of excitement and tension. "I can disrupt the energy flow, but it'll trigger alarms. They'll know we're here." "Do it," Jude said. "We'll hold them off." Finn's hands moved faster, the terminal beeping softly as he entered commands. The light from the core flickered again, brighter this time, and the hum grew uneven. Across the room, the technicians froze, their eyes darting to the consoles as alarms blared to life. The guards reacted instantly, their weapons raised as they scanned the room. Jude fired first, the crack of his rifle cutting through the noise. One of the guards dropped, his weapon clattering to the floor, and chaos erupted. Brock stepped into the open, his shotgun booming as he fired at the advancing guards. The sound was deafening in the confined space, but it held the attackers back. Reed fired wildly, his shots less accurate but keeping the guards pinned down. "Keep them off us!" Jude shouted, firing another shot that hit one of the guards square in the chest. Finn's voice was frantic. "I'm almost there. I just need a little more time." "Hurry up!" Reed yelled, ducking behind a console as bullets ricocheted off the walls. The technicians scattered, their shouts drowned out by the blaring alarms and the roar of gunfire. The core's light pulsed erratically, casting the chamber in a chaotic, flickering glow. Jude fired again, his shots precise and controlled, taking down another guard who had broken from cover. "I've got it!" Finn shouted, slamming the terminal's panel shut. "The core's destabilizing. We need to move now." The core shuddered, its hum growing louder and more erratic. The light inside it flickered wildly, and sparks flew from the cables that snaked across the floor. The entire chamber seemed to vibrate as the system began to collapse. "Fall back!" Jude shouted, motioning for the group to retreat. Brock fired one last shot before pulling back, his massive frame shielding Finn as they moved. Caleb stumbled but kept moving, his face pale as he clung to the sled for support. Reed ran close behind, his face a mix of terror and disbelief as the core began to implode. They sprinted toward the exit, the floor shaking beneath their feet. The core let out a deafening roar, and a blinding flash of blue light filled the chamber. Jude didn't look back as the explosion tore through the room, the force of it sending a shockwave that knocked them off their feet. Jude hit the ground hard, his vision swimming as he scrambled to his knees. The sound of the explosion still rang in his ears, and the air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning metal. He turned to see the others, all of them alive but battered, struggling to rise. Finn coughed, his face streaked with soot. Did we do it? Jude nodded, his chest heaving. Yeah, we did it. The group staggered to their feet, leaning on each other as they moved toward the tunnel. Behind them, the core chamber was a wreck, its once imposing structure reduced to a smoldering ruin. The clean city wasn't dead yet, but its heart had been torn out. As they disappeared into the tunnel, Jude allowed himself a rare moment of hope. They had struck a blow against Viktor and his machine. It wasn't over, but for the first time, they had a chance. Chapter 19. Escape. The tunnels were chaos, filled with the echo of alarms and the distant shouts of enforcers. The air was hot and oppressive, carrying the acrid stench of the core's collapse. Jude led the way, his rifle at the ready, his body moving on instinct. Behind him, Finn stumbled, coughing as he clutched his toolkit. Brock carried the sled with labored breaths, his massive frame barely fitting through the narrow passage. Caleb leaned heavily on the sled for support, his steps faltering but determined. Reed brought up the rear, his eyes wide with panic, his pistol clutched so tightly his knuckles were white. "We need to move faster," Reed hissed, his voice sharp and urgent. "They're going to flood this place with enforcers." "I know," Jude said, his tone clipped. "Keep up." The tunnel shook again as another distant explosion rocked the core chamber. The sound rumbled through the metal walls, sending dust and debris raining down from above. The blue glow that had once pulsed steadily through the pipes was now erratic, flickering like a dying heartbeat. The clean city wasn't just wounded, it was unraveling. Finn staggered and nearly fell, but Jude caught him, pulling him upright. "You okay?" Finn nodded, though his face was pale. "I'm fine, just keep going." Jude pushed him forward, glancing back at the group. Caleb's breathing was labored, and his face was drawn, but he hadn't stopped. Brock looked like he could keep going forever, though even he was showing signs of strain. Reed's eyes darted nervously toward every sound, his fear palpable. The tunnel branched ahead, splitting into 3 passages. Jude stopped, scanning each one quickly. The walls were lined with flickering emergency lights, casting eerie shadows on the floor. He turned to Caleb. "Which way?" Caleb hesitated, leaning heavily against the sled. "Left," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "That'll take us to the waste zone." Jude nodded and motioned for the group to move. They turned down the left passage, the air growing warmer and heavier with each step. The sound of alarms faded slightly, replaced by a low, ominous hum that vibrated through the walls. "What's the waste zone?" Finn asked, his voice shaky. "It's where they dump what's left," Caleb said. "The bodies, the failures, everything they don't need anymore." Finn's face twisted in disgust, but he didn't respond. Jude kept his focus ahead, his rifle raised. The tunnel sloped downward, the floor slick with condensation. The hum grew louder, and the air became almost unbearable, thick with heat and the metallic tang of decay. The tunnel opened into a massive chamber, and the sight stopped them in their tracks. The waste zone was a vast, cavernous space filled with towering heaps of debris, broken machinery, shattered tanks, and countless bodies. The remains were twisted and deformed, their features frozen in expressions of agony. The blue glow of the city's energy pulsed faintly through the room, casting a sickly light over the scene. Finn covered his mouth, his eyes wide with horror. This is what they've been hiding." Caleb nodded grimly. "This is the cost of their clean city." Reed turned away, gagging. "We shouldn't be here. We need to get out." Jude scanned the chamber, his mind racing. There were no enforcers in sight, but that wouldn't last. The waste zone was a dead end, a dumping ground. If they were caught here, there would be no escape. There, Jude said, pointing to a narrow service tunnel on the far side of the chamber. That's our way out. They moved quickly, picking their way through the debris. The stench was overwhelming, a nauseating mix of decay and burnt metal. Finn stumbled over a broken piece of machinery, and Brock caught him before he fell. Reed kept his gaze fixed on the tunnel ahead, avoiding the piles of bodies. As they reached the service tunnel, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Jude froze, his rifle snapping up. From the far side of the chamber, a squad of enforcers emerged, their sleek black armor gleaming faintly in the blue light. They moved in formation, their weapons raised. "Move!" Jude barked, firing a quick burst at the enforcers. The shots hit one of them, and the figure dropped, but the others pressed forward, their weapons barking in return. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, sending sparks flying. Brock stepped into the open, his shotgun booming as he fired at the advancing enforcers. "Go! I'll hold them off." "We're not leaving you," Jude shouted, firing again. "You don't have a choice," Brock growled, pumping his shotgun. "Get them out of here." Jude hesitated for only a moment before grabbing Finn and pushing him toward the tunnel. "Move! Now!" The group bolted into the service tunnel, the sound of gunfire echoing behind them. Caleb stumbled, and Jude caught him, pulling him forward. Reed was already ahead, his fear driving him faster than the others. Finn clung to his toolkit, his breaths ragged and panicked. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls closing in as they ran. The sound of gunfire faded, replaced by the distant hum of machinery. Jude's heart pounded in his chest, every muscle screaming for rest. But he kept moving, dragging Caleb with him. They emerged into another chamber, smaller, but just as oppressive. The walls were lined with rusted pipes, and the floor was slick with stagnant water. A single ladder led upward, its rungs coated in grime. "Up," Jude said, motioning to the ladder. "Go." Finn climbed first, his movements shaky but quick. Caleb followed, his face pale as he struggled up the rungs. Reed was next, scrambling upward without looking back. Jude waited until they were all clear before slinging his rifle and climbing after them. The ladder led to a hatch, which Finn pushed open with a grunt. They emerged into the open air, the ash-filled sky stretching above them. The clean city's dome loomed in the distance, its faint glow dimmer than before. They had escaped, but the cost was heavy. Jude pulled himself out of the hatch, his chest heaving as he surveyed the group. Finn was slumped against a broken wall, his hands shaking. Caleb sat on the ground, his breathing shallow but steady. Reed paced in tight circles, his face pale and drawn. Brock wasn't with them. Jude looked back at the hatch, his jaw tight. The sound of distant gunfire echoed faintly, then faded into silence. He turned away, his expression hard. They couldn't go back. Not now. The clean city was still standing, but its heart had been damaged. Jude knew their fight wasn't over, but for now, they were alive. And that was enough. Chapter 20. The Ash Road. The sky above was a blanket of muted gray, the air heavy with the omnipresent ash that clung to every surface. The group sat in silence at the edge of the wasteland, the clean city's dome barely visible in the distance, its once pristine glow now reduced to a flicker. Jude knelt near the broken wall, his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the barren expanse ahead. Every step they took away from the city felt like a victory, but it also carried the weight of loss. Brock wasn't coming back. Finn leaned against the wall, his face pale and streaked with soot. His hands trembled as he fiddled with his toolkit, though his focus seemed elsewhere. Caleb sat nearby, his breathing shallow but steady, his eyes distant as he stared at the horizon. Reed paced in erratic circles, muttering under his breath, his fear still palpable. Jude could feel the tension between them, the unspoken weight of what they had seen, and what they had lost. "We can't stay here," Jude said finally, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. "The enforcers will be looking for us." Reed stopped pacing and glared at him. "And where exactly do you suggest we go? We're out of food, out of filters, and out of options." "We still have options," Jude said, his tone steady but firm. "We need to head west, put as much distance between us and the city as we can. There are other settlements out there, people who might help." "Or people who might kill us," Reed snapped. "We don't know what's out there. We barely survived what's behind us." "Then keep your voice down and stop drawing attention," Jude said, his eyes narrowing. "We've made it this far. Complaining isn't going to help." Reed's mouth opened as if to argue, but he closed it again, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. He turned away, muttering something inaudible. Finn looked up from his toolkit, his voice hesitant. "If we can find a settlement, maybe I can trade some of this equipment. Filters, food, even a place to rest. It's worth a try." Jude nodded. "Good thinking, but we have to move fast. Caleb, can you walk?" Caleb gave a weak smile. "Not fast, but I'll keep up." Jude rose to his feet, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "Then let's go. Stay close and stay quiet. The farther we get from the city, the better our chances." The group set off, their footsteps crunching softly against the ash-covered ground. The landscape was barren and lifeless, broken only by the skeletal remains of buildings and the occasional twisted metal structure jutting from the earth like the bones of a long-dead giant. The air was thick and hard to breathe, even through their masks, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint whistling of the wind. Jude kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning for any signs of movement. The clean city was still visible behind them, a faint glowing scar on the landscape. He didn't trust its stillness. Viktor wouldn't let them escape so easily, and every step felt like they were being watched. As they moved deeper into the wasteland, the terrain grew more treacherous. The ground was uneven, riddled with jagged rocks and hidden pits that made progress slow and dangerous. Finn stumbled more than once, his exhaustion evident, but he refused to stop. Caleb struggled to keep up, his steps faltering, but each time he fell behind, Jude was there to steady him. Hours passed, and the group's pace slowed as fatigue set in. The ash seemed to cling to them more heavily with every step, weighing them down. Jude scanned the horizon, his eyes narrowing as he spotted something in the distance, a faint outline, barely visible through the haze. "There's something up ahead," Jude said, his voice low. He motioned for the group to stop, crouching low to the ground. "Stay here. I'll check it out." "Wait," Finn said, stepping forward. "If it's a settlement, they might be hostile. You shouldn't go alone." Jude shook his head. "If it's hostile, we're better off knowing before we all walk into it. Stay here. Keep an eye out." He moved cautiously toward the outline, keeping low and using the terrain for cover. As he drew closer, the shape became clearer. A cluster of buildings, their walls cracked and weathered but still standing. It was smaller than he had hoped, more like an outpost than a settlement. But it was something. A faint light flickered inside one of the structures, and Jude's grip tightened on his rifle. He crept closer, his steps silent against the ash. The faint murmur of voices reached his ears, too indistinct to make out. He paused near a crumbled wall, peering around the edge. Two figures stood near the light, their faces obscured by masks, their bodies clad in patchwork armor. They were armed, their weapons slung casually but within easy reach. Jude studied them for a moment, weighing his options. They didn't look like enforcers. Too ragged, too disorganized. They might be scavengers or survivors, but that didn't make them safe. He backed away slowly, returning to the group. "There's an outpost ahead," Jude said, keeping his voice low. "Two armed guards. Could be scavengers or survivors. Hard to tell." "What do we do?" Finn asked, his voice tense. "We approach carefully," Jude said. "If they're hostile, we pull back. If they're willing to talk, we see what they have. We don't have many choices. Reed shook his head. This is a mistake. They'll shoot us on sight. Then stay here, Jude said sharply. The rest of us will handle it. Reed glared at him but said nothing, his jaw tightening. Jude motioned for Finn and Caleb to follow, leaving Reed and Brock with the sled. They moved cautiously toward the outpost, their weapons ready but lowered. As they drew closer, the two figures turned, their masks glinting faintly in the dim light. Jude raised a hand in a gesture of peace, his voice steady but firm. We're not looking for trouble, just passing through. The figures exchanged a glance, their hands lingering near their weapons. One of them stepped forward, their voice muffled by the mask. What are you looking for? Supplies, Jude said. Food, filters, anything you're willing to trade. The figure tilted their head, studying him. And what do you have to trade? Jude nodded toward Finn, who held up his toolkit. Electronics, tools, information. The second figure stepped forward, their posture tense. Information about what? Jude hesitated, then spoke. The clean city. What's really happening there? The first figure stiffened, their hand moving closer to their weapon. You've been to the city? More than that, Jude said, his tone sharp. We've seen what they're doing. And we've hurt them. The two figures exchanged another glance, then lowered their weapons slightly. The first one nodded toward the buildings. Come inside. We need to talk. Jude motioned for Finn and Caleb to follow, his rifle still in his hands as they stepped into the outpost. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning.
We hope you have enjoyed this story. If you have, please share this audiobook with a friend. Your friend will appreciate it, and the Gigabizzle Bupenheimers of the algorithm will like it too.